Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Alex here. So today is going to be a special episode. We're going to be covering about wipeout openings. So what exactly are wipeout openings? Wipeout openings are basically openings that kind of trap you and essentially remove all of your discs, or basically ends the game by removing all of your excess in an overwhelming manner. Typically, your opponent is trying to maximize the game and trying to get as many discs as possible. Typically, you can see these people trying to maximize to grab a lot of the edges, and yeah, basically that's kind of like I would say a fairly intermediate or maybe a novice kind of strategy, but there are people who do that, and some of them they do it very effectively. So I'm just gonna show you some of the wipeout openings. There is a website in another website that shows a list of all wipeout openings possible, or at least most of them. And basically, out of those wipeout openings, I think some are fairly playable, some are not. So today, I'm just going to share four of these playable ones that I see in real life play more often than not. So the very first one that I like to share with you, which is the kind of rose variation. So typically, it's usable against intermediate players, I would say. People who just learned the basic strategy about group, small, and inside to Othello. So this is how it goes. So we start off with e6. So we have the sequence over here. I'll just run through quickly. So essentially, it's the rose kind of variation. So you play as black. You try to wipe out your opponent. White is playing as perpendicular. You jump into e3, and basically this is kind of like the standard lead up to rose. But instead of playing the typical c5 book move, you basically play like a kind of a radical move to g5 just to set up for that. So over here, chances are, as white, when you realize your opponent, maybe as an intermediate player, you realize your opponent might have played a very dispersive move. You might be tempted to kind of, you know, try to compact yourself as much as possible, or you think that your opponent is a beginner, you're not too sure what your opponent is doing, so you might want to compact. So if you were to kind of compare, playing small, group small inside, you might kind of look towards e7, f7, and f6. And comparing these three moves, you might be tempted to kind of form a more compact shape and keep it within the center 16 box. So the kind of expected response might be towards f6, and in fact f6 it is the best move for this situation over here. But over here, the next setup move for black for the wipeout is actually to play e7. So e7 is a fairly loud move and kind of sets up something for the wipeout opening. So typically, if you're the kind of intermediate player, you've not have that much experience, and you're basically you've just learned the group small inside principle, you might be very tempted to kind of jump into f5, given that it's only flipping one disc in one direction, and discs that are being flipped is still in the center of the entire board, so it seems fairly safe. But you then kind of realize that, hey, black actually has a move to c5 that kind of sweeps up all of your discs. So when that happens, basically the final score that should be reported would be 64-0 in favor of black, so that's a wipeout, because there simply isn't any more white discs on the board for you to play any legal move, and therefore all the empty squares by rules of the game is actually awarded to the winner of the game, which is black in this case with 13 discs. So the final score would then be 64-0 in favor of black. So that's kind of like a first level, a very basic level kind of wipeout opening. So yeah, hopefully with this knowledge you would kind of avoid the pitfall. So in fact, the best move over here, instead of jumping or rushing into f5 to kind of overly regroup, given that your opponent has played two consecutive loud moves, that's kind of a telltale sign of your opponent potentially setting up like a wipeout sequence. You would then consider perhaps f3 or f7 as something that you can form kind of end-to-end continuous disk, whereby your opponent probably don't have any way to sweep up all of your disks at once. So either f3 or f7 works. So yeah, that's essentially the first wipeout opening. Let's move on to the second one. So just moving on to the second sequence, I've placed the sequence on the board. You can read it over here. And of course, we'll run through the sequence. So essentially, this is another fairly common sequence that you might see in real life play, and I think it's probably easier to spot than the first one. It's the cat variation wipeout opening. So essentially, black starts off with e6, white goes to the perpendicular. So this is kind of how you set it up into the cat sequence. So you can see it's a cat opening, e3 over here, and then you basically have d6, which is the best move to kind of like be into the center, cutting and maintaining yourself into the center. So thereafter, black plays c6, which is kind of like a feed off move. So it's kind of like a telltale sign, or maybe that your opponent might be a weak player. And then thereafter, black goes into c3. So this is kind of like a telltale sign that is beginning to look a lot like your opponent is trying to maximize you. But essentially, what you want to do with the wipeout opening is to try and capture this. So of course, an intermediate or novice player, similarly, they are going to think, hey, the best move is going to be flipping one disc, grouping my disc together. We're going to keep it safe. We're going to keep it in the center of the board, so that's fine. Which is entirely fine. I believe f3 might be the best move in this case. But the next setup move, which is kind of like a third consecutive loud move by black, is to kind of set up f6. So this is another feeding move, which white, again over here might be tempted to actually jump into f5 to kind of reconnect its disks. And at the same time, you feel like, hey, a group of 6 disks, it's fairly safe. Why do I have to worry about getting wiped out? But over here, after this move is played, you realize that black can sweep up the disc to f2, and when you have only 3 white discs in the kind of inner square and surrounded by the external piece of the board, you can realize that it's kind of like a wipeout, because regardless of which direction you play out of this, because you're kind of in the inner layer and black has a full external outer layer on your discs, no matter where you play out, black can just follow with the sweep in that same direction. So regardless of what you do, you're basically, you're basically gonna get swept or wiped out. So even if you try to do something like this, perhaps, essentially you can't really escape it, because if you were to play this, you will still be swept down the line, and it will still complete that wipeout. So yeah, basically there's no support at all. There's no way out. If you take a minute, just look at the board, try to figure it out. No matter where you play, as long as black follows in that direction, you're pretty much trapped. Even if white does this and black goes this, you realize that all around white is essentially surrounded. So in Othello, even though it's good to minimize, it's not good to kind of overly minimize, given that you've seen a few telltale signs that your opponent is playing 2 or 3 consecutive loud or even feeding moves to kind of set up a loud sequence. So you probably wouldn't want to do that too much. So if you realize your opponent is maximizing you, try to kind of branch out to the external parameter instead of overly minimizing in the center. Try to find an anchor, perhaps, in a quiet manner, just to flip 1 or 2 discs, but at the same time just kind of guaranteeing that you do not get swept up or wiped out. So that's essentially the second wipeout opening. So yeah, just take a minute, just appreciate this position, and you probably avoid getting swept up like this in the future. So that's essentially the second wipeout opening sequence that I'd like to share with you, and let's move on to the third one. Okay, so essentially, this third sequence is slightly more complex and probably harder to catch. So let's take a look at the sequence. So, in fact, I've actually fallen prey to this one before, unfortunately. So basically, as black, you start off with e6, you set up to the tiger opening, which is kind of fairly intuitive. Typically, you probably play 10 games, and 9 of these games, if you play along this sequence against a perpendicular opening player, you probably get this sequence. So it's fairly easy and common to kind of execute it. So over here, instead of playing the usual E3 or F6, which are the respective tiger or Commoth opening, you basically play a fairly wide and weird looking move to G4. So it's kind of like just drawing the span over here. So when you play this move, perhaps your opponent might start to think that, hey, this guy is probably a beginner, he doesn't know how to play it. So obviously, as a fairly advanced player or intermediate player, from your opponent's point of view, 1, 2, 3 separate discs. Let's link it up. Let's play the c5. In fact, nothing wrong with that. That's the best move at this point. So yeah, basically group small inside. It's perfectly executed over here. So over here, the kind of interesting setup move is actually b6 over here. So b6 basically splits up the discs, and at the same time it sets up a potential trap. So as white, typically you might consider three moves, one of three moves, b4, b5, and c6. So ironically, if you wanted to maintain the center shape, if you were to play the b4, you might think that, hey, black might play b3 and momentarily control this kind of mini diagonal over here along the d3 and c4 disc this way. So essentially these two mini diagonals. So that might be a slight concern because white doesn't have an immediate prospect. So if your opponent is fairly strong when he anticipates that, he might be a bit concerned with playing that. So he might rule b4 as slightly weaker compared to b5 and c6. And of course b5 over here potentially gives some opportunity for black to say play this and momentarily control this diagonal perhaps. So that could potentially give a slight concern for that. And of course, white might think that, hey, why not I play c6? Because this momentary control along this horizontal line is actually typical of a very strong mid game when you control the pace or you control kind of the key end-to-end row or column, whereby you make your opponent having to make some outward moves at the end of it just to chase back the centralizing access. So typically you might, in fact, ironically, the stronger the player, the more likely he is to play c6. So yeah, once white plays c6, there is this weird sweep move along c7 that creates this kind of checkerboard shape due to the setup for g4 earlier, with having this branch over here for the diagonal cut. So that's kind of the trap, and you realize that, once again, the white disc is a lone disc in the center of the board surrounded by existing black discs, regardless of each of those directions in the horizontal or vertical or diagonal directions. No matter where you play, you're basically going to be wiped by black. So if you just take a moment and take a look and examine the position, you will realize, hey, it's a wipeout. So yeah, you can probably do this once or twice to an opponent during blitz game, or I don't know, maybe even a slow game, but this is probably just a one-off kind of wipeout opening. And of course, if you are playing white, you might want to take note of this just to avoid getting wiped out in this kind of strange sequence. So yeah, that's essentially the third wipeout opening. So yeah, once again, the setup, the split, and the kind of tempted regroup, and then with the sweep, and that's the wipeout opening for the third sequence. So in the fourth sequence, let's move over to white wiping out the opponent in a kind of more unusual manner. So just kind of moving on to the fourth sequence, I have it over here. This is kind of a slight different wipeout opening in a sense that it's not like the first three where you basically get overwhelmed or surrounded, but rather this is kind of special because it utilizes the edges to kind of nullify your access. So yeah, unfortunately, this is another opening that I have kind of fallen prey to in an actual game once before. So yeah, no shame in that, but it's a very interesting sequence. So you can see that this is one of the longer wipeout sequence. So let's give it a run through. So e6. So over here, this is actually a wipeout sequence for white. So you can see f6 basically leads up to the diagonal. f5 is the typical sequence, and d6 is kind of like symmetrically. Rotationally symmetrical along this axis, so it doesn't really matter. And of course, e7 is the Heath sequence for this particular wipeout. So after e7 is played, g5, which is fairly standard, it's still within the book. It's kind of a fair move to play to for white. So nothing fishy over here. g6, slightly different. So of course, typically black plays c5 as the best move for Heath, but some people might play g6, which is also a fair move, still within the kind of ±2 range perhaps, and something that is still acceptable. It's kind of like a leading to a sailboat of sorts that is perpendicularly rotated 90 degrees. Instead of a flat one, you have a vertical one. So thereafter g6, and then you have f7. So f7 is kind of like a setup move. It's almost like a rotated um, landau or maruka kind of maneuver. So down to f7. So over here, the f7 cross is kind of tempting black to kind of cross back to d7, which is fair enough. White crosses over, you want to maintain the center shape, you cross over, so that's perfectly fine, nothing suspicious about it. And of course, over here, when white chooses to play h6, it's perfectly concealed because it's basically a horizontal cut across the entire group of black. There's nothing fishy over here as well, because white is just cutting across, trying to maintain a shape, perfectly fine. So after h6, black would potentially go for f8 because c5 is too loud. It flips three discs, two different directions. Typically, you probably don't want to play c6 that feeds a diagonal cut over and allows white to just immediately jump into c5 to centralize. And it probably wouldn't make sense to just play a very dispersive move to c4. So chances are you might want to consider h4 or f8. So f8 is kind of a fair sequence because once you play f8, if you play h4, you might not be able to play f8. But if you play f8, you can still play h4 in the future, probably. And basically, black, when you play f8, this is kind of where the wipeout sequence is kind of set up. So white plays d8, which is kind of like a feeding move. It's very similar to probably the second and third, probably the first three wipeout sequences actually, in a sense that it's kind of like a feed. So chances are, when white plays this, you would be very tempted as black to just jump into e8 and feed off the edge because you've learned that, hey, unbalanced edges are attackable. You want to keep your disc group and inside. At the same time, you want to control the key access. And also, when you play e8 and you visualize white taking g8, you still have this e7 disc that provides access to an anchor at h4. So you kind of feel safe. Hey, black, white, black, that's perfectly fine. Let's go ahead with that sequence. So that's kind of setting up towards the wipeout. So over here, you might find comfort that, hey, I'm going to go to an edge because right now white is kind of maximizing me, capturing this edge and the bottom edge and the right edge. So it becomes a bit risky for black. So you might be tempted to kind of jump into h4 just to secure yourself an edge and just to kind of create an anchor. But unfortunately, over here, there is an overwhelming move that tends to be a blind spot to most players, in fact. You probably anticipate that, hey, maybe white is going to play e3. I'm still going to have a couple of moves to cut across the horizontal. But unfortunately, there is a wipeout move actually to f4 because once f4 takes away all of your discs in this center block, you realize that you're kind of stuck in a position whereby, hey, black has nowhere to go because these two discs are diagonally aligned with one another and it's already along the edge and all of the discs along this kind of mini diagonal is occupied. So the only way black can actually go out over here is to either play c7 or g7, both of which results in a total sweep. So once white plays h7, essentially it's a wipeout of 63 to 1 in favor of white. And of course, if you were to go the other way around, it would still be a wipe. And if you were to choose to cut out the vertical, it'd still be a wipe. And of course, if you were to choose the diagonal cut, it's still going to be a wipeout because black is essentially stuck at the edge thinking that, hey, I might have access. But unfortunately, due to the square gap, there's no way black can play any legal move because there isn't any continuous disc besides this diagonal line that has been occupied. So yeah, this wipeout opening basically teaches us that, hey, you have to be very careful and mindful even when you're playing early on in the mid game or opening stages when you're kind of minimizing. You even along the edges, you have to be very careful in terms of ensuring that you have a sufficient number of legal moves, even though you're trying to minimize, but you don't want to overly minimize. So that essentially is the special wipeout opening for white, and probably one of a kind in a sense that it kind of causes this dilemma in this edge play. So yeah, so I've also included a link in the description below where you have a list of quite a number of wipeout openings you can explore. But I would say that these 4 openings are the more playable ones in real life actual game, more likely to happen, unless you're overly minimizing. And definitely there are certain variations that can happen in the second and third wipeout opening, in a sense that you might be kind of surrounded in a different way, maybe a different sequence. That's also possible, but you just need to kind of understand that you want to be careful of this. So from an defensive point of view, you want to be mindful of these wipeout openings just to avoid getting wiped out. From an offensive point of view, I guess if you want to explore using these openings just for fun, you can probably use it on blitz games, or probably fun games between your friends. You probably will catch them unaware, or unless you're very confident that you can surprise your opponent at a tournament, by all means you can go ahead and try. But most of these wipeout openings from an offensive point of view carries a lot of risk. The moment the wipeout doesn't actually happen or is not successful, you would be kind of trailing behind by maybe easily 16 to 20 discs, or maybe even more. So it's extremely risky to kind of play out these wipeout openings. So of course, hopefully you enjoy this video, and yeah, just be careful not to be wiped out, and let's see you in the next episode. Goodbye.